Hello, everybody, and thanks for coming. Here comes Dr. Scheinman. Dr. Scheinman will be retiring from his position as president and dean of the Geisinger Commonwealth School of Medicine in a few months, but his achievements as the CEO of one of the most important institutions in the region, as an informed and engaged citizen, and as a friend and colleague of the Schemel Forum, will live on. The medical school has flourished on his watch. It has produced some first-rate physicians, some of whom will remain with us in northeastern Pennsylvania. It has joined forces with Geisinger, one of the most prestigious health organizations in the country. And thanks to Dr. Scheinman, it has collaborated with the Schemel Forum throughout his time here. And in fact, his legacy includes an ongoing relationship with Schemel. I'm honored to say that he is not only a personal friend, but a physician trained in the humanities as an undergraduate at Amherst College. That combination of science and liberal arts is reflected in the medical school curriculum, which aims to prepare doctors for a deep understanding of disease and wellness and a deep regard for their patients. Because of Steve Scheinman, our relationship with Geisinger will continue, as will our respect and affection for this humanistic physician. Steve?
Well, Sandra, thank you very much, sincerely, for that generous introduction. The Schemel Forum is something that I've admired since I arrived here in 2012, and as you said, I'm very proud of the partnership we have in the joint Schemel Forums. There's another one, I'll put a plug in for it now, coming up on Tuesday. Dr. Richard Kogan will be regaling us with his psychiatric insights into Beethoven, as well as performing. He's a virtuoso concert pianist. So I'm looking forward to that. And I'm honored to be asked to speak today. And my topic is this community's medical college. The name of this medical school is no longer TCMC, as in the Commonwealth Medical College, but it is TCMC, as in this community's medical college. How advances in pedagogy and technology and the pandemic have shaped medical education in the 21st century. And I will get to that. I will get to technology and the pandemic, but I think it'll be very useful to put this all in the context of medical education in general. And so I'm going to, there we go, begin with some comments about medical education in Europe and in America several hundred years ago. Through medieval times and into the Renaissance, medical education was largely the apprenticeship model. It was typically a one-on-one apprenticeship with an experienced practitioner overseen by the guilds, and of course, for the benefit of the professional interests of the guilds. But during the Renaissance, it evolved in Europe into formal instruction within universities. And there's nothing particularly significant about the year 1508 at the University of Wittenberg, except that this is the first year in which we have a documented record that a medical oath was taken. It was a version of the Hippocratic Oath in Germany in 1508. And throughout Europe, the incorporation of medical education into universities represented a move towards adding a scholarly dimension to the training of physicians. And particularly in Germany, that scholarly dimension included the advancement of science. In the United States, it was very similar. An aspiring doctor would apprentice himself, I'm using the male pronoun intentionally, to an experienced physician. And here in this 1891 painting by Luke Fildes, which is very commonly shown, and I'm sure you've all seen it one way or another, I think it's very helpful in conveying both the caring attitude of the physician and the helplessness of the physician. And that pretty much characterizes the nature, at least one would hope that caring was a key element, the nature of that relationship between the apprentice and the physician. This apprenticeship model persisted in the United States through the 17th and 18th centuries and well into the 19th century. There were no standards of education. There was no licensing or government regulation, no requirement for a degree or any kind of a certification. Some schools began to offer courses, beginning with a course at the College of Philadelphia, but they were not required for practicing. What ambitious aspirants to practicing medicine would do, if they had the means, would be to travel to Europe and attend lecture courses at Leiden, Paris, London, Edinburgh, and then return to the States and teach people here, take on apprentices. In 1752, the Pennsylvania Hospital was founded. It was the first hospital in the United States by Thomas Bond and Benjamin Franklin. And 10 years later, William Shippen, who had attended medical lectures in Edinburgh, returned to Philadelphia and began a series of lectures on midwifery and anatomy. This was just a lecture course. This was not a degree. The first MD was more than 50 years off in the United States. And he explained that he was offering these lectures, and this is a quote, "for the advantage of the young gentlemen now engaged in the study of physic in this and the neighboring provinces, whose circumstances and connections will not admit of their going abroad for improvement to the anatomical schools in Europe, and also for the entertainment of any gentleman who may have the curiosity to understand the anatomy of the human frame." So it may not have been all that different from one of the courses within the Schemel framework. He was joined 3 years later by John Morgan, who had been in Edinburgh with him as a student, when the College of Philadelphia created 4 professorships, one in the theory and practice in medicine, one in anatomy and surgery, one in clinical medicine, and one in chemistry. The professor of chemistry was Benjamin Rush, signer of the Declaration of Independence, and a really remarkable individual, paid a lot of attention to mental and behavioral health, and is credited with the phrase of being the father of American psychiatry for his attention to mental illness. He also went down a few wrong paths in advocating for purging and bloodletting and leeches. College of Philadelphia joined with the hospital that Benjamin Franklin had founded under the University of Pennsylvania in 1791. There were other medical schools founded in the late 18th and early 19th century. King's College, pictured here, established a medical faculty in 1767. This is the building of King's College on Manhattan Island in 1770. This evolved into the College of Physicians and Surgeons, now part of Columbia University, which granted the first MD degree in the United States in 1807. Harvard College established a medical department in 1783. Dartmouth College established a medical department in 1798, and Yale in 1810. These were not schools, they were not conferring degrees. Yale's medical department became a school only in 1884. And throughout the 19th century, there was a burgeoning of establishment of medical colleges, some of which came and went. Many of them were proprietary for profit. This plaque commemorates the Edinburgh Medical College in North Carolina, which you can see was chartered in 1867 and folded up in 1877. So if you add up all of the transient medical schools in the 19th century, like this one, there were a total of 447 medical schools between 1810 and 1910. In 1847, the AMA, which had recently been established, tried to get some control and quality imposed on this multitude of schools, and recommended something very ambitious, that the medical training of a doctor should be at least 6 months long, including lectures and an apprenticeship. And that was only a recommendation, and it was largely ignored by many of the medical schools. Forgive me here. There we go. Among the medical schools founded in the 19th century was the American School of Osteopathy in 1892, founded by Andrew Taylor Still, who was an interesting character in the history of American medicine. He was the son of a Methodist minister who also practiced medicine. The son, Andrew Taylor Still, was throughout his life a spiritualist and also an abolitionist. He had a number of principles which he held to quite firmly. He apprenticed with his father as a physician and served as a hospital steward in the Civil War, which exposed him to surgery. It's not clear how active a role he took in any of the surgery that he saw, but he then made a personal study of medicine over several decades after the war. And that medical study included, on his own, robbing graves for the purpose of dissection and learning anatomy. He apparently took some medical courses, and he was, through this experience, disturbed, and his experience in the war, disturbed by the harm that he saw done by medical treatments, particularly mercuric chloride, which was used for a number of purposes. And so over the course of this self-study, he established principles of what he called osteopathy, which included that the proper alignment of bones and muscles was central to health, that the body has an inherent capacity to heal itself. He felt that preventive medicine was critically important in avoiding disease. What a concept. And he thought that one of the most important functions of a physician was to avoid harm. His sense of avoiding harm extended to prescribing drugs. He objected completely to prescribing drugs. And in fact, the American Osteopathic Association, which was formed around the turn of the 20th century, did not allow the teaching of pharmacology in osteopathic schools until 1929. He founded his own school in Kirkland, Missouri in 1892, and over the next 10 years, another 7 osteopathic schools were founded. And osteopathy was not the only alternative to what was called by others either scientific medicine or allopathic medicine. There was also chiropractic, electrotherapy, eclectic medicine, naturopathy, and homeopathy. In fact, Samuel Hahnemann, the founder of homeopathy, which I won't go into today, is the one who coined the phrase allopathic medicine, which is which is largely used to distinguish MD training from osteopathic training, DO training. By the turn of the 20th century, there were 160 medical schools in the United States. Many of them were proprietary. They were for-profit ventures with the profit divided among the faculty. In fact, in many cases, they were owned by the faculty, all of whom were part-time. They were mainly practicing physicians who valued their appointments to the medical school because the graduates would then refer them patients when they needed help. And so the faculty appointment was valuable in some cases more for the referrals than they were for the profits that the schools generated. There was no, at the time, the turn of the century, no standard curricular content. There were state licensing boards that had emerged in the late 19th century. And all but one state had them by 1900, but only 22 states required any diploma or passing any examination at all to practice medicine. There were variable lengths of training, but it had improved since the mid-19th century. So the standard by 1900 was 2 years of lectures in a school. When I say lectures in a school, those 2 years included no clinical training. Some schools required 3 years of lectures, and one radical school, Johns Hopkins, required 4 years, and it included clinical training. And only one hospital in the country had residency training after medical school, and that was the Johns Hopkins Hospital that had been co-founded by Sir William Osler, who we'll visit in a minute. And the model at Johns Hopkins was that after graduation, the graduate would be interned at a hospital, and then they would subsequently become residents at the hospital. They were called house officers for a reason, which is that they lived in the hospital and worked 24/7. That tradition lasted well into the 20th century. When I was a medical student in the 1970s, I was taught by people who had been in the first group at Johns Hopkins, who had gone to every other night on call at the hospital, living in the hospital every other night. And the residents objected to that, because if they were in the hospital every night, they only had to take care of their own patients, and everybody else was there taking care of their patients. If they were every other night, they would have to take care of not only their own patients, but someone else's patients. They'd rather be there all the time and know their patients well. But Johns Hopkins was the only institution for 20 years that offered residency training. In 1904, the AMA created a Council on Medical Education with the goal of creating standards for medical education. And the standards they proposed in 1904 were that one should not be allowed to enter medical school without at least a high school diploma, which was not required at many medical schools. And that medical education should include at least 2 years of classroom work and 2 years of clinical training following the Johns Hopkins model. And that gathered some traction, but not much. Then came Abraham Flexner. Abraham Flexner was not a physician. He was born in Louisville, Kentucky in 1866. He was the sixth of 7 children from an unsuccessful businessman, a Jewish businessman in Louisville. His siblings, however, all had stellar careers. His brother, Simon Flexner, was a prominent pathologist. He became the first director of the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, subsequently Rockefeller University. And Simon Flexner's pathological research led to the discovery of a species of the Shigella bacteria that's named for him, Shigella flexnerii. Abraham, his younger brother, went off to college from Louisville to Johns Hopkins, where he studied, Sandra, Greek, Latin, and philosophy, and graduated, although college was 4 years even then, he graduated in 2 years, returned to Louisville to teach high school, and frustrated by what he saw as the ineffective and hidebound methods in the typical high school, he started his own private high school using progressive educational principles. For example, problem solving in small groups rather than rote memorizations, no exams or grades, a flexible curriculum, and his school generated wide attention. Charles Eliot, the president of Harvard, noticed that the graduates of this little school in Louisville, Kentucky, were performing more successfully than the graduates of Exeter and Andover and the other prep schools that fed Harvard. And so he was paying attention to this young man in Louisville, Kentucky. The school became very successful, and Flexner sold it, and also married a successful writer who wrote children's books and plays. And these funds allowed him to pursue further studies. So he went to Harvard and earned a master's, an MPhil in philosophy, and then traveled in Europe studying education, higher education, at universities in Britain and France, but especially Germany. And he particularly admired German education. And among the things he learned was how firmly based in science the medical education in Germany was. In 1908, he published his book on higher education called The American College, which received wide attention. It was highly critical of the methods of American higher education in general. And he particularly praised the German model, where science was the lodestar. And he advocated that all physicians should have a background in laboratory research as a preparation for clinical investigation at university hospitals. So as I've mentioned, Flexner went to Johns Hopkins. He maintained strong ties to people at Johns Hopkins, and that Johns Hopkins perspective reinforced his admiration of the German model. Hopkins was the first American medical school to follow the German model. Its founding dean, William Welch, who had studied at Yale and Columbia Physicians and Surgeons, also went off to Leipzig and studied under the so-called father of pathology, Rudolf Virchow. And Virchow was a groundbreaking scientist, and said that, this is a quote from Virchow, medical practice is nothing but a minor offshoot of pathological physiology as developed in laboratories of animal experimentation. That's how firmly based in science this tradition was, even disdainful of clinical practice. The German model and the Hopkins model also included something that had not occurred other than in spotty ways in American education: full-time faculty who were fully engaged in research and teaching, and only as a side interest took care of patients if they did at all. Johns Hopkins was the first school to require a bachelor's degree, not just a few years in a college, but a bachelor's degree to gain entrance to their medical school. So the AMA, having been frustrated that their recommendations in 1904 had not gained widespread acceptance, contracted with the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching to survey American education. And Henry Pritchett, the head of the Carnegie Foundation, engaged Flexner. Flexner originally thought that Pritchett was mistaking him for his brother Simon, because why would they engage an educator who had no experience in medicine, was not a physician, to survey American medical education? But Pritchett felt that a professional educator was just what was needed. He would have the credibility and the perceived objectivity to make a proper study. And what Flexner did was a very proper study. He physically visited every single one of the 155 medical schools in the United States at the time. And he issued his report in 1910. And to digest his report down to the bottom line concerns he expressed, there were too many physicians. And he not only assessed the quality of medical education, but he did a workforce analysis, calculating how many physicians are needed per population, and calculating that there were about we were producing about 3 times as many physicians as the United States would need, that there were too many medical schools. We didn't need to be producing that many physicians, and they were, many of them very small, and very many of them of terrible quality. Many medical schools required minimal or even no educational preparation. As I mentioned, even a high school diploma was not required by many medical schools. And the medical education was not occurring in a scholarly setting. As I've said, many of these were proprietary, for-profit, independent schools, and not affiliated with the university. There was no standard structure to medical education, no standard content, no formal structure for clinical experiences. In fact, most medical schools, or many medical schools by then, still were not even offering clinical instruction. He broke down the schools into three categories. His highest praise went to the schools he rendered adequate. And those included Johns Hopkins, which it was clear was his model. There was a second category of schools that he felt were not quite adequate, but were redeemable, either by investing in better facilities, in better faculty, by adopting a more robust curriculum, or by consolidating together. He recommended widespread closures of medical schools. He recommended that the number of medical schools in the United States should be not 155, but 30. That over 3/4 should close and the remainder should consolidate, so that they could have, they consolidate around the schools of the best quality and invest in providing the best experience. And he also explicitly criticized throughout his report, the osteopathic schools, the homeopathic, the naturopathic, and other alternative medical approaches. And that, of course, fit with the AMA's agenda to promote allopathic education. Unlike the AMA's recommendations, his publication in 1910 created what one writer has called a tornado of attention on this problem. It generated wide attention. This is part of the page, a full page and continuing article in the New York Times Magazine in July of 2010. Factories for the making of ignorant doctors. Carnegie Foundation's startling report that incompetent physicians are manufactured wholesale in this country, which is not hyperbole. It's not a hyperbolic summary of Flexner's conclusions. Flexner's language was really quite colorful. He described some of these schools as some of the facilities as filthy, foul, inarguably inadequate. And some of his descriptions are quite colorful of anatomy laboratories where there weren't complete cadavers, there were just body parts scattered in a space that was half had tables for destruction, for demonstration, and the other half of the space was a barn, a chicken coop. This headline is not hyperbolic, but you see, I don't know if you can see my cursor. This is a picture of New York University Bellevue Hospital. The Times made a point of saying that the three medical schools in Manhattan, NYU, Cornell, and the physician and surgeons at Columbia, were all deemed adequate by Flexner, and he felt they should persist. Some schools took the recommendations very seriously. Washington University in St. Louis, which was deemed adequate, was so concerned by the criticisms that Flexner pointed out that the dean invited Flexner to visit. And after the visit, the dean fired the entire faculty and hired a new faculty that were based in science and that were researchers. Similarly, Flexner worked for a number of years with two deans at Yale, and is credited, even though he never had a position at Yale, credited with transforming that medical school. So his recommendations were that medical schools for entrance should require at least 2 years of a college education. should provide a fundamental foundation in science taught by faculty engaged in research. He felt that practitioners would have too many clinical demands, would not be reliably available to teach, and that the proper scientific basis for education should be people whose lives are science rather than whose lives are trade. And that medical schools, therefore, should be part of a university, and not just any university, but a university most favorably should be a university located in a large city, because those are places that would have hospitals of adequate size. That there should be 2 years of formal coursework and lectures and labs and 2 years of clinical experience in a university hospital. And that the medical schools should control the clinical instruction at the hospital. And these recommendations were taken seriously. He also recommended strengthening of state regulation of medical licensure. And that the 2 years in college should include chemistry, biology, and physics, which they still do. And that the 4 years of medical school should include the coursework in anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, and pathology, which they still do, and clinical training in medicine, surgery, and obstetrics. Pediatrics had not emerged as a separate field from medicine, and psychiatry wasn't on his radar. So what were the consequences of his report? I call this his legacy because it has had sustained effects. Most medical schools in the United States closed. There were 160 in 1904, and 5 of them had already closed by the time his report came out. But over the next 10 years, another 70 schools, nearly half of medical schools, closed in just the first 10 years. And by 1935, there were only about a third as many schools as they started, as there had been at the turn of the century. Almost all of them within a university. So a number of schools that had been independent aligned themselves with universities. Medical curricula became uniform. In fact, one could say it became so standard that it became encrusted. Alternative medicine basically disappeared from medical curricula. And research became the dominant culture in American medical schools. So there were other consequences as well, because it was clear that although he made some polite remarks about the role of women and the role of African Americans as physicians, he was disdainful and patronizing about both. At the turn of the 20th century, 1900, 6% of all practicing physicians in the United States were women. And in some cities, it was many more. In Los Angeles, 15%, Boston, 18%, Minneapolis, 19% of all practitioners were women. And there were 8 women's medical colleges by the end of the 19th century, although by the time of Flexner's report, 5 of them had not been able to sustain themselves. And after the report, 2 of the 3 remaining medical schools for women closed. So the only medical school for women that survived the Flexner Report was the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, which was the first women's medical college founded it was founded in 1850. Here is the first women's medical college building on Arch below 7th in Philadelphia. In 1970, it went co-ed and admitted men, and subsequently was folded into Drexel. So it's now part of Drexel's medical school. But the percentage of women at all of the other medical schools in the United States also declined. In 1900, Cornell, Tufts, Boston University, Johns Hopkins had between 20 and 35% of their class as women. And by 1940, that was less than 10% in all of those schools, and much lower in most other schools. Now, that decline through the 1940s is surely not entirely due to Flexner's having prompted the closure of 2 women's medical schools. It was a widespread reduction in the number of women going to medical school, but it did happen. And of course, that number is now 50% at all medical schools, 50% nationally. Flexner was also quite disdainful of African Americans as physicians. There were 7 historically Black medical colleges when his report came out, and only 2 of them survived. He only felt that Howard and Meharry were adequate. This was very significant when 5 out of 7 the Black medical schools closed, because very few of the other medical schools in the United States would admit any African American students. Flexner ostensibly was holding African American medical schools to the same standards that he was holding other medical schools, and I get that. But he was not considering that Blacks had fewer opportunities to prepare for medical school, and because they so often couldn't afford the kind of tuition that was paid at other medical schools, the Black medical schools did not have the resources to generate the facilities and the faculty that would have earned Flexner's respect. But he was beyond education of African Americans in medicine. He was disdainful of African Americans in general. He viewed them, and he says this in his report, he viewed them as a source of contagion. That's a quote. He felt that the only reason to countenance the education of Black physicians was so that they could care for Black patients. He said, and this is a paraphrase because I'm not remembering the quote exactly, that African Americans are better off being, and of course he used the term Negro, Negroes are better off cared for by a good Negro physician than by a bad white physician. And so this is part of Flexner's legacy, that over a century after his report, only 4% of American physicians are African American. And 80% of that 4% are graduates of Howard and Meharry. In other words, only 20% of African American physicians are graduates of the other 153 medical schools in the United States. So the AAMC for many years granted a very prestigious award to medical schools for the quality of their medical education, named for Abraham Flexner. And a year ago, they renamed the Abraham Flexner Award on account of his racist views and their consequences. Now, the man standing here speaking to these other Black physicians is Charles Drew. Charles Drew is a giant in American medicine, and he's called the father of the blood bank. Charles Drew, pictured here at the center with his hands on the patient, is a graduate. Since Sandra gave my pedigree, I'm going to proudly say that Charles Drew graduated from Amherst College, where he was a football star. Even though he was by far the best football player on the team, he was not the captain because he was Black. He went on to McGill for his medical school because McGill in Toronto, outside of the country, had a more tolerant view of accepting African Americans. And then graduating first in his class, he achieved a position at Columbia for his residency in surgery. But when he arrived at Columbia, he learned that he was being steered towards surgical pathology, in other words, a blood bank, because he wouldn't have to deal with patients as much that way. Yet he excelled in that. He developed techniques for the preservation of plasma, which saved countless thousands of lives because this happened just before World War II. He headed up the government's Blood for Britain project. He invented the bloodmobile. And yet, ironically, he couldn't donate blood because Blacks were not allowed to, until the Army decided to allow Blacks to donate blood and segregated the blood according to who received it. Charles Drew was a giant of American medicine who like Jackie Robinson, endured all sorts of indignities. But there were many positive consequences of Flexner's report as well. One was standardization of state licensing. So there were state medical boards, as I mentioned, before Flexner. But in 1912, explicitly as a consequence of his report, they organized themselves into a single federation of state medical boards, which promoted consistent state standards across all of the states. In 1915, the National Board of Medical Examiners was formed and established national examinations to determine competency to practice medicine. Residency training, which was first pioneered at Johns Hopkins, became much more common in the 1920s. And it was typically a single year of a rotating internship in multiple specialties, but a number of hospitals added additional years. And by the post-World War II era, residency training was the norm and was common everywhere. And so pretty much every graduate, by then, graduates of medical school were required to have at least 1 year of postgraduate training as an intern. And by the 1950s, pretty much every graduating medical student could find an internship and a residency. In 1942, the Liaison Committee on Medical Education, it was a committee formed jointly by the AMA and the American Association of Medical Colleges, which is why it's called Liaison Committee, was formed in 1942 and provided standardized accreditation for all MD granting programs in the United States. And with the burgeoning of residency training in the post-war era, in 1952, the National Intern Matching Program was formed, which evolved to the National Resident Matching Program as residencies became the norm. And in 2020, starting in 2014, the American Osteopathic Association and the American Council for Graduate Medical Education agreed that they would evolve towards a single accreditation system. So allopathic training and osteopathic training have the same accreditation once you've graduated from either an MD or a DO program. And that finally took place last year. And so there are not separate matches for those residencies. And the training is the same after you get the degree. The difference is that programs that about a third of all osteopathic residency programs closed when it became clear they weren't going to be able to achieve accreditation with the ACGME. But there are some programs that were formerly osteopathic that still train the art of manipulation. And even allopathic graduates can get certification in those residency programs in osteopathic manipulation, but that's not required for practicing. And most DO graduates do not practice osteopathic manipulation. So much has changed over this past century. Before Flexner, no college was required. You could get your MD in 2 years. You didn't have to do a residency. So a total, and he didn't even have to graduate from high school for some of them, total of 2 years of training. Now, you must have 4 years of college, 4 years of medical school, and residency training, which is a minimum of 3 years, and in some specialties is 7. So that adds up to potentially 15 years of training. And there are many people who contributed to this, but the single person who had the biggest effect on bringing this about was Sir William Osler, a Canadian who is known. I've mentioned people as the father of American psychiatry, the father of the blood bank. Sir William Osler is credited as being the father of modern medicine. And I think if anyone deserves that name, it's him. He received his medical degree in Toronto, and at a young age was brought to Penn as chair of their Department of Medicine, and then was stolen away by the newly forming Johns Hopkins University. He was one of the two co-founders of the Johns Hopkins Hospital, at which so many of these revolutionary advances took place. And then he left Hopkins to become the Regius Professor of Oxford, Regius Professor of Medicine at Oxford University. He revolutionized medical education in a number of ways. He created the clinical clerkship within medical school, for the first time giving medical students a role in patient care, not just hanging on, but actually giving them a role in patient care. He pioneered bedside teaching rounds. So when you see on television a TV doctor surrounded by residents and students, Osler invented that. He once said that he wanted his tombstone to read simply, "He brought medical students into the wards for bedside teaching." His tombstone doesn't read that, but that's what he was most proud of. He also, as I've mentioned, founded the first residency training program. And he was a prolific writer. And some of his aphorisms include the following: "He who studies medicine without books sails an uncharted sea, but he who studies medicine without patience does not go to sea at all." Probably his most famous aphorism is, "Listen to your patient. He is telling you the diagnosis." That is quoted all the time on the wards to remind students to take an adequate history. And I don't know how many of you have felt that at your doctor's office, your doctor has asked the kind of question that makes it clear what the diagnosis is. But it's Osler who reinforced that tradition. He objected to Flexner's notion, before Flexner, he objected to the Germanic notion that future practitioners should be taught primarily by faculty whose primary work was research rather than clinical practice. He himself did no research, and yet he was world famous. Residency training didn't exist anywhere. He invented it. He did publish a groundbreaking textbook of medicine and a number of books on history. He was a bibliophile as well. As a consequence of Flexner's report, research became the dominant culture of American medical schools, in contradiction to the culture that Osler created at Hopkins. And my experience as a medical student in the 70s at Yale was that almost all the people who taught me were people whose primary activity was research, who also saw patients. They were actually very good clinicians, but there was no question that walking the halls, the people who got the most respect were the scientists. And the people who were full-time practitioners who were teaching us the art of practice did not have that level of respect. And that was in the 1970s and into the 1980s. A major feature of the post-Flexnerian movement, which I'm about to describe, is that practitioners are now accorded much greater respect than when I was training. Curricula emphasize the primacy of the patient. And William Osler would be very pleased to see this. Much has changed in medicine and in education since 1910. Flexner's report ushered in a century of remarkable achievement. The American medical schools became most successful as research pillars. Nearly half of all Nobel Prize winners in medicine have been faculty at American medical schools. Of course, miracles in medicine were made possible by advances at American medical schools as a result of that research. Specialization, technical advances have led to miraculous abilities to cure in many kinds of diseases, but have also led to fragmentation of care and dilution of the doctor-patient relationship. And as illustrated on the slide, the demographics have changed. Schools now actively seek minority students And as I've mentioned, 50% of all women, of all medical students in the United States are women. And medical education has evolved, particularly in the last 30 years, 20 or 30 years. A number of things have evolved in medical education before the establishment of the new schools that I'll be talking about. These include allowing students to practice taking a history, doing a physical examination on simulated patients, on actors pretending to be patients in a simulation center, or practicing their physical exam skills on mannequins and their procedural skills on mannequins. That didn't happen when I was a medical student. We learned how to do a physical exam and take a history on sick patients in the hospital. This is much better. Early clinical experiences, those 2 years in the classroom have now shortened in many medical schools to 1.5 years or less. And during that 1.5 years, they are having clinical experiences often from the first week in medical school. Medical school is measuring competencies and advancing students according to competency in defined skills much more than in the past. And medical humanities are now commonly a part of medical education. That first happened in the 1980s at Penn State in Hershey. And with regard to residency training, duty hours are now restricted. So you're not allowed to not just live in the hospital or be every other night in the hospital, or as I was, when I was training, every third night. So every third day you have a 36-hour shift. Now residents are limited to 80 hours by law. But there are some archaisms that still persist. Over a century after Flexner, his framework, 2 years in the class, 2 years on the wards, largely remains intact. Those courses, anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, pathology, are still the basis for the curriculum in most medical schools. And medical school admission requirements, physics, organic chemistry, calculus, are still required at all medical schools. There's no reason for that. Students would become much better physicians if we required a simple fundamental basis in chemistry and biology and maybe epidemiology and population health and genetics in college. And, frankly, proficiency in a foreign language, which trains your brain to think differently, to see people and hear people differently. But no, we're still clinging to archaic requirements and lectures. So this is obviously not a recent photograph. It's not even a painting, it's a woodcut. Lectures are a medieval form of unidirectional information transfer. They have no place in 20th century education. If you want to transfer information, we now have methods that are much more effective. And the bulk of information is so massive that it is not possible in 4 years, even if it was 4 years of nothing but lectures, to transmit it all. What we need to be educating in medical schools, and some new medical schools are doing this now, is to train students to ask the right questions and know how to go about framing the question and getting the right answer. And that's what we do, and that's what several other medical schools do. But they carry around more information on their iPhone than we could drill into them in 4 years of lectures. Flexner himself denounced lectures, even though one of his consequences is that every school offers 2 years of it, because they allow faculty, and this is a direct quote, to handle cheaply by wholesale a large body of students that would otherwise be unmanageable, and thus give the lecturer free time for other pursuits. And so, yes, most medical schools still rely heavily on lectures because it's just very difficult to organize things other ways. But as we and other schools are showing, it can be done. So who are these other schools? As I mentioned, the Liaison Committee on Medical Education was founded in 1942, and this timeline begins there with the accredited MD granting schools. And you can see that the Hill-Burton Act, which promoted a lot of construction throughout the United States in the post-war era, prompted the building of medical schools. And then the Health Professions Education Assistance Act in the 1960s led to direct federal aid for the founding of new medical schools and support for the nursing programs and other educational programs. And in the wake of that, between the mid-60s and the early 80s, 37 new medical schools, new MD granting schools appeared. And then there was a 20-year gap with no new schools until Florida State University started a new medical school in 2004. Now, in the 1960s and 70s, workforce projections were that there would be a shortage of physicians and we needed a lot more doctors. And so there was this proliferation of medical schools. And then the workforce experts changed their minds in the 80s and said, oh, we're now going to have a glut of physicians and that's going to drive costs up. And you'll remember those arguments, those of you who were reading newspapers in the 80s. So there was a talk about restricting the number of physicians produced. But then with the growing of the population and the aging and increase in medical needs, it became clear, and is patently clear now, that we do have a shortage of physicians. And so there have been 33 new schools since Florida State that have been accredited or are in the process of being accredited by the LCME. Similarly, for osteopathic schools, there were 5 osteopathic schools that survived Flexner. And then in that era of the 70s, the number of osteopathic schools tripled from 5 to 15. And then in this era, starting in the 90s, the number of osteopathic schools tripled again from 15 to 43. And osteopathic schools tend to be a much larger size than allopathic schools. And so osteopathic graduates now represent about 25% of all medical doctor graduates in the United States, and they are a growing percentage of the physician workforce. So among those new schools that was founded is the Commonwealth Medical College. It was unique among the new medical schools. The others were all founded either by a university or a health system. We were founded by this community. And through curriculum and ongoing engagement, the school maintains strong roots and connections with the community. So it was incorporated in 2008. The first students arrived in 2009. And those students included 13 students in our master's program, one-year program. So our first graduates were master's graduates in 2010. This wonderful palace of a building opened in 2011. And our first MD graduates were granted their degrees in 2013. Among the things I will regret in my retirement is that someone else will start handing these out, because I have now handed out every MD degree awarded by this school in its history. It's long and storied history. We achieved full accreditation in 2014, and that was reaffirmed for the maximal term in 2019. We launched campuses at Guthrie in 2015 and at Atlanticare in 2019, and those are 2 of our most successful campuses. We are now in the process of launching a campus in Lewistown, a West campus. We expanded our master's program to Doylestown, where it is now offered, and we now have over 200 graduate students in addition to our 450 medical students. And very significantly, in 2017, we became part of the Geisinger Health System, which of course solidified our finances and guaranteed our future. But I think very importantly, it opened enormous opportunities for our students in clinical training within an integrated care delivery system, where the insurance and the care are provided by the same entity, which provides a financial incentive for that entity to keep patients healthy and out of the hospital. And to be able to train our students in that environment is something that we are taking advantage of in our curriculum. It also provided wonderful opportunities for our students with regard to research. And then in 2021, just in August of this year, we launched our new curriculum. And our board voted to approve the establishment of a degree-granting school of nursing in Lewistown. So I will finish up with the innovations that we would characterize as post-Flexnerian. One is active learning. From the time we started, we were 80% of the experiences of our students in the first 2 years was not in lecture. Labs, simulations, small groups, case-based learning, team-based learning, but 20% was too much. So our new curriculum launched in August has no lectures. There are only 3 medical schools in the country that do that. The University of Vermont, where Dr. Bill Jeffries launched that new curriculum 4 years ago with no new lectures, and he now is our vice dean here, leading our curricular efforts. And the Kaiser Permanente School of Medicine in Pasadena, brand new medical school, hasn't graduated its first class yet, no lectures. The longitudinal integrated clerkship, which is a longitudinal experience whereby students spend many months seeing the same patients over again. And we were the first medical school in the country, in the world, to implement this new clerkship model for the entire class. Community engagement is a defining characteristic of our curriculum. And we've now launched, within the last couple of years, free medical education, free tuition and fees, and a $2,000 a month stipend. We pay our students to go to medical school if they make a service commitment to work at Geisinger in primary care or psychiatry. 45 students in each class. Community engagement is manifested in a number of ways. We have our Reach High pipeline program that we're very proud of, launched by Ida Castro for disadvantaged high school and college students. Launched originally with $2.4 million of federal funding, and continues with more modest funding from generous donors, and an impressive track record of student success. This year, we graduated. The first student who had started in the Reach High program in 10th grade graduated with an MD from the Geisinger Commonwealth School this May. We also, thanks to Ida, have a $3.6 million 5-year award from HRSA for a Center of Excellence to diversify the healthcare workforce, which is providing mentoring and opportunities for minority students, and is a wonderful partnership with Geisinger's clinical system. Our behavioral health initiative, which has over 50 community partners, including the Wright Center, with whom we've co-sponsored a psychiatry residency program that will graduate its first psychiatrists this June. And our curricular focus on the community health research projects, social determinants of health built into the curriculum, 100 hours of community service required of all students, consistent with the vision of our founders who came from this community. And our campuses are throughout the community. We have 5 clinical campuses. Our 5th one will launch in June in Lewistown. But as you can see, our students train not just in northeastern Pennsylvania, but also in southern Jersey and on the northern tier of our state, southern tier of New York State. They have wonderful experiences at Guthrie and Atlantic here. The Abigail Geisinger Scholars Program is a reimbursable loan which covers, as I mentioned, a monthly stipend, all tuition and fees, as long as they commit to return to Geisinger after residency and practice primary care or psychiatry for 4 years. 45 students in each class of 115 in either primary care or psychiatry. And we've enhanced our curriculum within medical school in primary care. We graduated our first Abigail Scholars this past May. And so Fitzhugh Mullen called us the paradigm of the post-Flexnerian medical school because of our innovative curriculum and community engagement. Fitzhugh Mullen was the founder of the post-Flexner movement. We've launched our new curriculum, which does not follow Flexner's paradigm. The first phase 1, which begins in year 1, gives students their roots in fundamental science, but it does that through clinical case examples taught by active clinicians. They then move into a clinical immersion phase that we use, the metaphor we use is the trunk. And finally, in their last year and a half, they branch out to study fundamental science more deeply and to explore specific areas of medicine. With longitudinal themes that are integrated across all 4 years: personal professional development, primary care, population health, health system citizenship, community immersion, and social justice, equity, and inclusion. None of these were discussed in Flexner's report. And this is a great deviation from the standard encrusted curriculum that Flexner prescribed. And we're not the only school that's moving in this direction. There are probably about 24 schools that are incorporating these elements in one way or another. And then finally, COVID hits, as we are in the process of developing a new curriculum. And so for 4 months, from April through August, March even, we closed the building, and all teaching, clinical and didactic, was virtual. And then when students returned, we had adapted in any number of ways. First of all, we developed an electronic ICU, allowing students to round on patients in the ICU virtually. So here is a doctor standing next to an ICU patient, looking at the student on the TV screen, the patient's TV monitor. The patient has a readout that they can see on their laptop that can give them all the patient's vital signs and laboratories, and can talk to the patient and the doctor. And the only thing they can't do is put hands on the patient. So if they ask, they want to know is the liver enlarged, they can ask the doctor to examine it and tell them. But this is an innovation that we think will have create significant opportunities, not just for the ICU, because our students are back in the clinical setting now and can go back into the ICU, but for patients on isolation, for remote clinical sites, or for clinical sites where the patients are more diverse than they are at other sites, for virtual clerkships. So this is something that we think in some form or other will endure, and other medical schools have expressed strong interest in it. Telemedicine became an important part of caring for patients throughout the pandemic. My doctor visits this past year have been virtual, and so we give our students that opportunity. We teach anatomy virtually. I'll show you that in a minute. And we've had a lot of experience with online learning, didactics, online counseling of students, online advising, online meetings. We've gained valuable experience in how to do that right. It's created opportunities, for example, when we want a busy clinician to lead a discussion on the physiology of lung function. They don't have to drive up from Danville and cancel a half day of patients to teach a 1-hour session. They can teach it virtually from Danville, and that's working really well and has helped us implement this new curriculum. We received attention in Time magazine for the way we're teaching in the EICU and telemedicine. This is a medical student with a nurse who's sitting in a patient's home talking to the doctor virtually. So our medical students experience telemedicine, sometimes sitting with the doctor talking to the patient on the screen, sometimes sitting with the patient talking to the doctor on the screen, and sometimes sitting at home talking to both of them on the screen. Telemedicine does not allow for everything that needs to happen between doctors and patients in some circumstances, but it can be enormously valuable in inner cities, in rural environments like ours. The no-show rate for a telemedicine visit is much lower than for an actual visit, and it's going to be part of life going forward. And finally, virtual anatomy. So we acquired, through the CARES Act funding, 3 sectra tables. These are like huge iPads which can either be tilted up, as you see on the left, or laid flat, as you see on the right, with the teacher demonstrating anatomy to two students. And on this sector table, you can peel away layers, you can peel away muscles and skin and nerves and blood vessels and demonstrate whatever you need to demonstrate, in many ways more accurately than you can on a cadaver, where once you've cut, it's now no longer preserved and colors are not preserved. And so we are now incorporating this into our standard teaching of anatomy to complement dissection. So it's not quite the same as the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp, painted by Rembrandt, but it is a very effective way, and we were able to continue our teaching of anatomy through a pandemic using those sector tables to teach students at home. And so finally, I will conclude by observing that medical education, I think, is moving in a direction of which both Flexner and Osler would approve. Flexner prescribed that 2 years, that medical school should be part of a university. Now, many medical schools are part of clinical systems, as we are. And you know something, that makes a lot of sense, particularly since clinical systems are so science grounded now. Flexner prescribed 2 years in the classroom, 2 years on the wards. Now, many schools are integrating clinical and basic science across all 4 years and integrating it through active learning, not lectures. And I'm sure Flexner would approve of that, particularly since he made those disdainful remarks about lectures. Flexner prescribed clinical experiences in an urban hospital, and now more schools like us are immersing students in community experiences in ambulatory settings. And that's the way much of medicine is practiced now, even high-end medicine. And Flexner prescribed that faculty should be primarily engaged in research. Osler would be very pleased that active clinicians are now much more significantly a part of the curriculum. And clinical practitioners nationally far outnumber researchers on medical faculties. And so in all these ways, I think our medical school, through both our original curriculum and our new curriculum, is at the forefront. While we have changed our name to Geisinger Commonwealth, we are still this community's medical college. So Sandra, I fear I've probably run over, but if people aren't in a hurry, I'm happy to entertain questions.
Does anybody have any questions?
Sandra, you're muted.
Oh,
Yeah, I do.
okay, John, you can go ahead.
Steve, thank you very much. It was very interesting. In light
Thank you,
of
John.
all the changes after Flexner in terms of the number of medical schools, what's the right number today? Do we have enough today? Do we need more? I know that we get 7,000 applications a year and can only take 115. So how does that stand now?
John, that's a really interesting question because we would not need to increase the number of medical students at all, since there are many thousands of qualified foreign physicians who seek residency training in the United States, and only about 7,000 of them will get residencies. And you can't practice medicine in the United States without an American residency training board certification. And so the real limiting factor, while there are about 32,000 residency positions each year, new residency positions, and there are only about 25,000 American graduates, the limiting factor is really the number of residency positions. If we could increase the number of residencies, we would increase the number of practicing physicians that we would produce. And so if we increase the number of medical schools and the seats in medical schools without increasing the number of residency positions, what we will simply do is squeeze out the foreign medical graduates. Now, one could make the argument that those are talented people who we would be providing the world a service if they stayed in their countries and provided care to their own populations. But from the point of view of the needs in America, many organizations have made a strong argument that we need to increase the number of residency programs. The problem is that medical schools, while they're heavily subsidized by clinical systems, the medical students pay tuition. Residents are paid, and about 75 or 80% of all residencies in the United States are paid for by the federal government. And so that would require literally an act of Congress. And you know how hard that is.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Steve,
Maury,
yeah, Steve, tell us somewhat about admissions. That is, how dependent are you on MedCats, GPAs, student approach, commitment to the area, et cetera?
yes, well, we, as you might imagine, we give a lot of thought to this, and we've recently modified some of our admissions practices, but the MCATs and GPAs are strong predictors of how well somebody does on written tests, multiple choice tests. And that is something that physicians will be doing throughout their lives. Their board exams now people need to be recertified on their boards every few years. But that's only one dimension of being a physician. And with regard to how good a person will be in listening well to their patients, in processing and synthesizing information, and in their work ethic and their service ethic, MCATs and GPAs tell you almost nothing. So we look at them as a minimum basis for screening, because there are data that students below a certain minimum threshold of MCAT score have a higher percentage of failing in medical school. We do not want medical students to fail because we've invested heavily in them. But once somebody has demonstrated that they can handle the work, our view is that the academic record is not relevant. And what we want to do is assess their character, their communication skills, their listening skills, their service orientation. And so out of the 7,100 applicants that we got this year, we offered interviews to 900. All 900 were people who, on the basis of their academic record, we were convinced could do the work. And once we're convinced they can do the work, we don't look at the academic record anymore. Once they've made it to an interview, what we look at is a range of evidence of their commitment. So what service opportunities have they availed themselves of in their young lives? What testimonials do we see in their letters of recommendation about their character? And how well do they perform on the interviews? And we've completely revamped our interviewing now. The standard way to interview a medical student is to have them do 2 interviews, sometimes 3, of an hour's length with individuals, a full 45 minutes or an hour with one person, and then a second interview with another person. And their entire likelihood of getting into medical school hinges on those subjective interviews. And interviewers vary widely in their stringency with which they assess students. Some of them are in love with everyone they meet, and some of them don't like anyone they meet. And it's very hard to be objective, for the committee to be objective when they receive input that's so varied. And so what many schools have had experience with, and we've moved to, is a multiple mini interview. It's like speed dating, where a student moves across 11 stations, and at each station there is one person who asks one question. And it's the same question to every student who comes past that station. And they get 7 minutes on that question, and then they move to the next station. And so one interviewer can assess 30 applicants on the same single question and grade them in a semi-quantitative score. And those semi-quantitative grades go to the admissions committee. Schools that have been using this for a number of years find that it's a much better way to get at issues of character and communication skills, the kinds of things that go beyond academic record. So we've moved to that this year.
Thank you.
Sharon, go ahead.
Thanks. Thank you for this presentation. I am curious about those of us who have plans or have done so already of dedicating or donating our bodies to some form of exploration, science, however that will work out, and how that will impact the virtual kinds of procedures that are available. And so as I was watching this huge computer with the virtual bodies, I thought, I wonder if they're going to need mine. And so I'm curious about that.
My view is yes, we do need it, and thank you very much if what you've done is made that commitment. There are medical schools that have done away with anatomy labs. Some of the new medical schools, when they built their new buildings, did not build anatomy labs for that reason. And I think most medical schools are now taking advantage of virtual modalities. But I think where the students are missing out on something if they don't actually have the physical experience of dissecting a cadaver. And there are a number of components to that. One is the tactile sensation, but and the ability, there's a three-dimensional sense that you get for handling the anatomical structures that, although they may be demonstrated visually really well with these virtual modalities, there's a dimension you don't get with them. Another dimension you don't get with them is something that is ephemeral, but I think real. And I don't want to overstate it by calling it a spiritual dimension, but for a student to put their hand on the body that they're going to be dissecting and to make an incision in the skin, simple as that is, I think is an important milestone in their professional development. And I remember very clearly my first day in the anatomy lab. I was scared to death and I didn't think I'd be any good at it. And so therefore I asked my colleagues, there were 4 of us at this table, if I could make the first incision, and I did. And I remember feeling that was really, I was really being honored by that patient and being allowed to do that. And what a statement of hope in the future and of faith in these students. For that donor to have said, I want my body to be of use, even after I'm not using it anymore. That sense that student takes away from that experience, I think, is still very valuable beyond what it teaches them about anatomy itself.
Thanks. Thank you.
Is there anybody else with any questions?
Well, we have 5 more minutes.
Well, quickly, I will just ask Dr. Scheinman, what do you think about these natural decomposition gardens that are that I'm reading about in different places, and the thought of just being shipped off to decompose somewhere? That kind of sounds interesting to me, but I'm curious about what your thoughts would be.
Well, I don't think it's a medical question or even an education question, but I think it falls in the category of, as we were just discussing about dissection, being useful after you're gone. And this is one way to be useful, is to contribute back to, it's a cycle of life. And whether you go into the earth in a coffin or are cremated or simply allowed to decompose. It seems to me a more, I don't know, it strikes me as something perhaps at least contributing in some small way beyond how you would contribute in a coffin. Now, coffins are not going to preserve the body forever anyway. So I think the end point is largely the same.
Yes? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Sandra.
Okay, then I'm going to, seems if no other questions. I think your history, you as a historian, get an A+, and you get, we are, of course, we're giving grades, and you're an A+ all the way, and we hope to keep seeing you more even in your, after you are retired by. You'll
I look
still
forward
be
to it, Sandra.
partly a Scrantonian.
Yes, always a Scrantonian. Thank you very much for your kind words, and I should put that grade on my resume.
Okay. Promise.
My transcript.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.